I have the pleasure to introduce someone that is the head of GAN. What is GAN? It's Global Apprenticeship Network. And what is the Global Apprenticeship Network? Well, it's a creation of the B20 process. It's the baby of the B20 process some years ago. Nowadays, it's not a baby. That's the reason why which is, has the leadership of Shea, and that is doing a great job doing so. And as you know, in Germany, social partners plays an important role in the creation and development of the successful dual education scheme. How does the GAN, globally and locally, ensure that the social partners are engaged in training programs in other countries? That's a part of the question. And the second part, can you give us some examples, positive examples on that?
Well, thank you, Daniel. And as Daniel said, we're actually in action out of the G20, B20 process. And we only started actually 3 years ago. But today we have 171 companies that have joined, and as of tomorrow we'll have 8 GAN national networks in countries. So apprenticeship, in fact, by nature, is the oldest public-private partnership. Without the public and the private, you don't have an apprenticeship program. And so at the global level, we have large companies like Accenture, UBS, Hilton, and then we have also the IOE, the ILO, the OECD, and BIAC as members of the GAN. And so we work together to get commitments by companies, but also by our social partners. We get them to share best practices. We get them to advocate, because remember, apprenticeships are often in many countries thought to be second-class jobs, second-class education. So we put a lot of emphasis in trying to advocate for the whole concept. And lastly, we facilitate multi-stakeholder dialogue. Now, at the local level, where we're finding where we have the most impact and change is, in fact, when we set up these national networks. And to give you an example, our first one, coming out of the G20, was in Turkey. We set it up with the help of the Employers Federation, with the local unions, with the parents, universities, institutions, and our companies. And when we started out, we said, well, we have to make an environment where not only we advocate for this, but we also make it easy for companies to start up apprenticeship programs. And quite honestly, legislation is a serious issue in many countries, but we thought this could take some time. But much to our surprise, with the help of TISK and our Turkish colleagues, they brought the companies together with the government, and within 6 weeks we changed the legislation. And there were incentives for companies to take on more apprentices, and they were paying some of the social security benefits. Now, to me, I was shocked that we were able to make that sort of progress. But there's a lot to be said with getting the right people around the table. And that's the beauty of the GAN, is we don't do it alone, we bring our partners together. I'll give you another example, G20. We had our meeting where we invited all of you, and many of you came to South Africa 2 weeks ago. And we had the CEO of Accenture there talking about we need to get together and build a platform together and to start getting companies together. When I sat down with them and they said, Shea, how do we do this? Let's think about this. They said, the companies clearly said, we don't want to do this alone. We don't want this to just be one company. We want it to be a coalition. And so we brought together the Employers Federation, we spoke to the government, and now we're going to start together a group in South Africa. So I think the beauty is that when you talk about public-private partnerships, this is the best example, and it works.
Thank you, Shea. During the morning, many times was mentioned the question of Africa and the work with Africa and so on. And Klaus mentioned some things related to that. And besides your comments, I want to know also if you are working, the GAN is working with Africa at this moment, because all the things that we are talking about are related one with the other. That's the question by which I raised that question.
Just to add on to what can companies do, a positive story on global supply chains is something that we're finding is that many MNCs are actually really working with the SMEs and to share their educational programs for apprenticeships. And we even have examples in Africa and also in Indonesia where companies have actually set up foundations to pay for apprenticeship programs, but these are for people who will never work in their company, but they will work in companies that are in their supply chain. So I think there can be some, it's one of the things we have to realize, growth is going to be, job growth is going to be in SMEs. Apprenticeship programs are expensive, but you don't need to reinvent the wheel. We can look at Germany, we can look at Switzerland. German companies and Swiss companies are sharing their programs in the United States as well as in Africa today, because there's no point in reinventing the wheel. But we do say don't cut and paste. You have to represent sort of your culture, your, adjust it to your local circumstances. But I think there's a lot that could be done, and I think we're losing a bit because we're not sharing the best practices. There are a lot of good stories out there. So you asked me about Africa. I will say when we started out in the GAN, we thought we were going to mainly be in developing countries. And to my surprise, through the G20, we actually had a huge event at the White House last year, because the US, although we tend to think of it as a big economy, they're learning from A to Z about apprenticeship rights now. They only have 500,000 apprentices in the US, and they want to bring this up to 5 million. So how do you do this? It's learning through others. In the case of Africa, we've been very fortunate that we had the MasterCard Foundation sponsor both Malawi and Tanzania. But it's the same issues in the United States as in Malawi. We needed to bring the government together, the minister. We did our launch, and it was really exciting to see that there's such enthusiasm in one of the poorest countries in Africa. But the private sector is coming together with the government. And we actually had the government saying, at our launch, what do you, the private sector, need in order to create more apprenticeships? And so we see this growth in Africa. So now we've done Malawi, Tanzania. Our next move is into South Africa and then to Kenya. But many of these countries have educational systems based on either the French system or the British system. And those systems were all often leading to Cambridge and Oxford and university degrees and not to vocational training. And so there's this whole sort of renaissance of apprenticeships, but also there's a very important part of changing the psyche and sort of saying and getting people to accept that you don't necessarily have to go to university in order to have a decent job and a life and being able to provide for your family.
Thank you.
Well, Danielle, I think you know me well enough. I'm not very good, I have to say, at meetings unless we have some action. And that's a bit what the GAN is. So if you're not a member and you're sitting in the audience, you should join the GAN. Another thing is if you're in Tanzania on May 4th, on Thursday, please join. A lot of your companies are in Tanzania. We move on to France with Adecco and Accenture assisting us in launching a network in France. The Netherlands, we're going to launch with Randstad taking the lead. And then I would say when Argentina takes on the G20, we already have the ILO, who is going to be sponsoring another meeting for us to look at within the Latin American countries' apprenticeship programs. So the important thing for me is share, because many of you around the table have best practices. Please advocate for apprenticeship programs. And if it's internships, traineeships, that's how you want to start, at least start it. And then lastly, commit, which means 1%, 5%, 10% increase in taking young people into some sort of employer-driven education.
Thank you, Shea. In 3 seconds, that's the remaining time, I want to say thanks a lot to all of you for this coordinated, well-organized, challenging debate in which we had the views of the G20, the L20, and certainly 2 of our main